Gluten sensitivity seems to have been rising over the past few decades, but it has definitely accelerated in the past few years based on my anecdotal observation with patients, what they're saying, and as well what seems to be occurring in the news. Something is going on. And this is what has led me to be able to try and share with you information about what I think is the explanation as to why this is happening. And when I think about it, I am making reference specifically to this gluten intolerance epidemic that you never even knew existed. What is going on? If you have been suffering with worsening gut related symptoms, especially bloating, constipation, not sure what's going on, this may be the driver that you need to understand. Why would it accelerate after COVID? That's part of the question that I am trying to understand. And I want you to join this webinar. If you beyond the date of Thursday, you should look in the link and you should be able to see a replay of it. But this is an important discussion because it is very relevant to your health. Now, why and what could be going on? I'm going to share with you something that has been happening over the past few years. And this here was in November 25th, 2022. And they were already looking at what is driving the rise in dietary wheat sensitivity. And so they got a number of experts looking at it. You can see here Dr. Dyer Suter, Dr. Ferenc Beckes, and they were looking at the science in terms of what was going on in terms of these cereals and why were we seeing this rise in terms of gluten sensitivity. Now, a lot of people, when you say gluten sensitivity, they don't really know what really you're talking about. It just sounds like some kind of strange terminology. Well, I'll give you just an idea. Gluten is all around you. And I've broken down some of the most common foods that it's in based on their content of gluten, just as a simple idea. And when you look at this here, you realize that in terms of the higher gluten content here, you have bread, pizza, pasta, bagels, chewy bagels specifically. And pizza has some of the highest content, especially the chewy doughs that you have, because the gluten helps to make it more chewy. In the medium are things like rye bread, couscous, breakfast cereals. This is up to about 10%. This would be about 12 to 14% gluten. And then down at the bottom, say 5 to 8%, things like beer, sausages, the sauces that you could make in soups and so on. That's where you have lower content. But the point is, it is that it is everywhere. You're taking it in quantities. And why in the world would this becoming an issue at this stage? What I'm going to be doing in the webinar, and I'll be going through this in more detail, I'll be showing you the historical context of this as to why I think this is so relevant. And I'll be taking you all the way back to 2002. This was from the WHO. And at the time, there was a lot of concern about this product, acrylamide, in food. And what they were finding was that when bread was being baked or when wheat was baked above a certain temperature, they found that this increased the risk of carcinogens. This acrylamide is known to cause cancer in lab animals, and they hadn't seen the connection in humans. But they were this concerned that they tried to find ways to address the issue. And this is part of what I'm going to be telling you about as to why I want you to join the webinar. This kind of information nobody really talks about. I remember when I was researching it, maybe even 10 years ago, when I figured out what was the issue, I couldn't find any information on it. It was like it was hidden. So you have to join the webinar just in case you're just joining here now. Remember, this is all highlighting the fact that I'm going to be doing this webinar on gluten intolerance, the hidden epidemic you didn't even know about. And this is going to be accelerating with regards to COVID. And there's a reason for that, which I will just touch on at the moment here. And the reason is just down to the principles around gluten intolerance. And when you look at this here, this slide here shows you some basic principles here. This is showing you just some bread, which was coming from wheat. And then normally, the gluten or the specific protein here in terms of the gliadin is normally digested and then turned into amino acids. But when it's only partially digested, you then end up with pieces of it, which can then trigger the immune system. And this is essentially what happens in celiac disease, and you have activated immune cells targeting this. So whenever people eat, it damages the gut lining, it causes all kinds of other symptoms. They end up with antibodies being produced as well. So the whole principle of this gluten intolerance becomes a real issue in terms of celiac disease. But it's important to know that I am not talking about celiac disease. Celiac disease is almost at one end of the spectrum, the severe end of the spectrum. What seems to be happening is that more and more people can't tolerate it. And there is the principle of gluten intolerance. And when I was talking about the paper, they kind of broke it down into a number of different sections. And this is what I mean by that. When they looked at it, celiac disease, which is 0.5 to 2% of the population, is when they have a severe, significant allergy to the wheat. And then you have a wheat allergy, which is not as severe. And this one can cause skin rashes, asthma. And this is another example, 0.2 to 0.5% of the population. But this is the bit that is really interesting. The non celiac wheat sensitivity, 6.5% of the population. And then when you look at up to 11.5 to 14.1% of the population are reacting to other things, fructans and so on, causing irritable bowel syndrome, you start to realize that this is pretty significant. And once you have something that is dealing with the immune system and causing the immune system to operate in unusual ways, that process gets exacerbated by COVID. That's where the two things come together. It was a problem beforehand, and I'll tell you why based on the acrylamide when we come. And I'm highlighting this again. This is so that you come to this webinar so I can be very clear about this information. Look in the link below. And so the principle is that there was a change that occurred in the early 2000s to try and mitigate this cancer risk. The problem was it caused another change that could therefore increase, in my view, when I look at the science, the risk of the sensitivity of people to gluten. That's where I think the problem is. And then when you have the COVID pandemic and you have this whole process exacerbated, that's where we have a really significant problem going across the population. So, this is what is happening at the moment. And this is why I think it's such a critical piece of information that everybody needs to know about. And the worrying thing is that most people are not even aware of it. It's not until you're interacting with patients and they are having really unusual symptoms. And I usually ask a simple question. I say, do you eat pizza? And very often people will say, yes. I say, what happens when you eat pizza? And they'll say, well, I usually get some mild bloating. You know straight away because pizza has some of the highest content of gluten. And so, therefore, if they're having those responses to either white bread or to, say, pizza, it suggests that they may have an intolerance that they need to address. Now, the food industry may not be happy about this conversation because they want you to continue eating as much gluten as you can because that's what's primarily on the shelves in supermarkets. But at this point, you have to be more savvy than that. You have to be careful, reflective, focused on your health, recognizing that if you give COVID any window of opportunity, it will break through it. An idea has just popped into my head that I'm going to share with you. It's something that I didn't know about, but in countries that have very cold winters, where you have water freezing, they have to cover the cracks in the walls because if water gets into it and then freezes, it breaks them open. This is how you have to be in this post pandemic period. You have to recognize that any crack in your health, the virus will exacerbate it in the same way that you have the freezing of water in the cracks of a wall, making your problems bigger. And gluten is one of the very simple strategic things that you can address. Everybody has control of what they eat. You need to be aware of the science around what you eat. So remember, as a final parting word, remember to join me on this gluten intolerance. If you are beyond the date, look out for the link to be able to see this presentation so that you can learn from it and understand it more. Final point, most people are not even aware as to this is a fundamental part of getting to their optimal health, the root roadmap. I recognize these patterns, and this is why I oftentimes say to people, you need to grasp this approach in order to get better health. If you're interested in that as well, look in the link below in order for you to get more information. And remember, we're coming up to the final launch with regards to Disease X. Are you prepared? And this one here is the book. We're doing the pre-order. Remember, fascinating book. I'll do a focus on it quite shortly, but if you want to join us, please click on the links below. There's a lot of work that has to be done to protect your health, but you have to realize that generally the population is far more vulnerable than it was. Everyone needs to be wiser, more savvy in terms of protecting their health against the ravages of SARS-CoV-2, which is still circulating. Thank you.